efficiency, precision, speed, effectiveness, accuracy. All these and more are things we think of as characteristically German. Here's another one: dying. Europe faces the reintroduction of a Germany desperate to preserve its post-war gains in an environment where mere survival is beyond its ability. From an economic point of view, Germany's geography is too good. Between the Rhine, Elbe, Oder, Danube, and a half-dozen minor rivers, Germany boasts about 2,000 miles of natural waterway. The Rhine and Elbe access the North Sea. The Oder empties to the Baltic, and the Danube winds to the Black, and from there, the Mediterranean. Germany's river footprints grant it the best economic access of any territory in Europe, arguably of any territory in the world. But what makes sense economically does not always make sense in other ways. Squatting squarely amid the Elbe, Rhine, and Upper Danube are Germany's central uplands, a rugged, densely forested mountain knot that resists infrastructure even in the 21st century. Germans tend to live in an inverted V, roughly following the Rhine and Elbe, arcing around the central uplands. German lands are traditionally both Europe's richest lands and their most separated. The lands at Germany's edges are its core territories. Historically, other, more consolidated European powers have had a breezy time of taking what they want from the Germans. The early Germans dealt with this the only way they could, by organizing into something better: a stronger educational system, a better workforce, more reliable financing, more productive manufacturing systems. Yet the geographic separation of the central uplands made it impossible for the pre-industrial Germans to do this at the national level. Civic governments became responsible for issues of finance and infrastructure, and education and foreign policy normally reserved for national authorities. Germany's independent city-states tended to develop organizational capabilities at the local level far superior to those at the national level of their much larger neighbors. Excellent civil government is part and parcel of what it means to be German. For most of German history, there was no Germany. Identities and competencies were a strictly local and regional affair. Nearly all German cities have a lengthy stretch in their past in which they were the core of a small German kingdom. Only the most successful of these German statelets, Prussia, a heavily militarized state that originated in the northeastern German lands, ever got big enough to achieve any economies of scale. The arrival of the industrial technologies in German lands in the 1840s and 1850s found fertile ground in dozens of advanced cities that could all apply all the technologies all at once. Among the first things this constellation of German urban regions did was run industrial road and rail links to one another. German industrialization made German unification not only possible, but inevitable. Some German communities, used to functioning as independent powers, resisted. So did all the Germans' neighbors, who rather enjoyed having shattered, easily exploitable people next door. But with new roads and rails enabling direct inter-German commerce and cultural consolidation, they were denying reality. Between 1864 and 1871, the various German statelets found themselves on multiple sides of three major wars. By the end of 1871, it was all over. A unified Germany was, finally, born. The fusing of Germany's industrialization and unification processes shaped Europe's next several decades. Contemporary Germany's biggest problem is demographic. When Germany industrialized, the entire country did so at once, which means it also urbanized all at once, which means the German birth rate started falling throughout German lands all at once, and it never stopped. Birth rates might tick up on occasion during economic booms, but with most Germans living in cramped conditions, there's a big difference between deciding to try for a second kid and a third one. About the only thing that encourages people to have more kids is for people to have more space. That's why Germany did have a baby boomlet during a period they understandably don't enjoy discussing. The Lebensraum era of the late 1930s, when Germany was busy annexing its neighbors and getting physically bigger. Germany's World War II defeat wasn't simply economically, culturally, and militarily jarring. It physically reduced the size of post-war Germany by roughly a quarter. The post-war governments of Germany's neighbors forcibly ejected the Germans living in the formerly German lands. Post-war German authorities almost universally settled these expellees, who accounted for about 18% of the population of the combined West Germany and East Germany, in urban apartments with little space for living, much less procreating. Contemporary German social stability is predicated upon a generous, ironclad, cradle-to-grave system of government services. Germany has been able to afford it because of a triple quirk in its demographic structure. Both East and West Germany enjoyed a brief baby boom between 1955 and 1965. That generation has been working and paying taxes for decades, and in the 2010s is at the height of its earning and tax-paying years. Germany's boomers didn't have many children, circumscribing expenses for services like primary education and childcare. The state instead directs the savings into value-added items, like higher education and infrastructure. Some 8 million Germans died in the world wars, gutting populations that would have been retirees in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. High tax receipts plus few dependents equals excellent government finances. But this golden age of high tax receipts and low government payouts is ending. With the exception of the Lebensraum, German reproductive rates have been edging down for 16 decades and are now far past terminal. The nearly childless German baby boomer generation enters mass retirement in the 2020s, cursing contemporary Germany with a collapse in productive capacity, a collapse in tax receipts, a collapse in consumption, and an explosion of state outlays for pensions and health care. As soon as 2030, the young generation entering the workforce will be less than half the size of the boomer generation retiring. In any normal country, this would spell economic and social failure. Such ruin assumes that economic trends in Germany are positive. The quest for efficiency and quality, so central to German identity, comes at a cost. All those local and regional German governments try to capture private savings to fund community goals, leaving little in the way of financial resources for the development of a consumption-centric culture. Pair high production with low consumption, and the only option is to export the difference. Late 1800s Imperial Germany was able to absorb its output because then, like 1990s China, Germany was industrializing. But by 1900, over half the population had moved off the farm, making it the world's first majority urbanized country. An achievement, yes, but there was nowhere else for its production to go, except abroad. The mix of overproduction and subsequent imperial trade barriers ensured a litany of recessions, price crashes, and general economic dislocation. European interstate competition, already political, became deeply economic as well. It was only a matter of time until it became strategic. The first of those strategic competitions, World War I, ended with German defeat and kicked off the Great Depression, which struck nowhere worse than where it started, in Germany. Americana tells tales of Depression-era city folk returning to the farms to work the land during the Depression's deepest years. Not so in Germany, where the majority of Germans had been living in cities for decades. The only thing the Germans could do to keep costs down was to not have children. Germany's post-Cold War unification was a phenomenal national achievement, but that doesn't mean there were no side effects. The new national government decreed that the value of the former West and East German currencies would be broadly equalized, despite the East's far less advanced industrial plans. The valuation decision aimed to preserve the personal savings of the former East Germans, a political necessity in savings-driven Germany, but it has gutted the competitiveness of the East German economy ever since. Not only did this haunt the Germans with echoes of the sort of dislocation and unemployment they experienced during the Great Depression, but family formation, and from it, birth rates in the former East, crashed and never recovered. There is never a good time to have a terminal demography, but contemporary European economic trends argue for now being among the worst. A rapidly shrinking working-age population, paying a higher tax rate to support an ever larger retiree population, means Germany's already weak ability to absorb its own production weakens further. It is more important than ever for the Germans to have a place to send their wares. Germany's biggest exports by value are automotive, with 80% of the cars Germans manufacture at home being sold outside of Germany. The European Union is no longer that place. While few countries have as poor a demographic structure as Germany, most of those in the running are also within the European Union. The rest of Europe has aged beyond being able to serve Germany as an export sink. Europe isn't economically capable of filling that role, even if its demographics were healthy. At least some portion of the continent has been in recession at any given time between 2007 and 2020. because the Germans provided the largest chunk of the financial assistance required to bail out the EU's failing members, but Berlin conditioned that support on budget cuts. Europe's weaker countries are Europe's weaker countries because they lack Germany's sublime economic geography. The state spending of these weaker states is part of what helped those weaker states close the gap with the Germans. German-imposed austerity gutted growth potential, and from it, Europe's capacity to absorb German products. Northern Europe, with all its flats and seas, is a rough-and-tumble region, with everyone in everyone else's face all the time. Germans, right in the middle of it all, have little choice but to treat military issues the same way they treat everything else, by being better. Germany's very strength invites panicked challenge. The rise and fall of Germany is European history. The only way the Europeans have ever discovered to prevent this never-ending cycle of wars is to change the game, to bring in an external security guarantor who forces everyone to be on the same side. In Europe, the institution that operationalizes the American-led order is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The NATO alliance shoehorned all European militaries, Germany included, into a single command and logistical structure under American strategic and operational authority. NATO's twin goals were to force an internal Western European peace while also securing Western Europe against Soviet aggression. As Hastings Ismay, NATO's first Secretary General, so famously put it, the alliance's raison d'etre was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. With the Cold War's end, Germany entered the best of all possible worlds. NATO expanded into the former Soviet Empire, surrounding Germany with allies. Germany's military ceased being relevant, largely because it ceased existing. Repeated past-the-bone budget gougings functionally eliminated all German air, naval, and armored deployment capacity. For all intents and purposes, Germany no longer has a military. From 1990 until 2020, this has been fine. After all, Germany didn't face major security threats. And so the spotlight shifted from NATO to the parallel European institution formed by the Europeans themselves, the European Union. Unlike NATO, which benefits from a very large and in-charge leader and a crystal-clear founding goal, the EU tends to muddle through. Is it an economic union? A financial union? A political union? A counterweight to the United States? A free trade zone? As of early 2020, the EU has 27 members. The British left the EU in 2019, and if you ask the EU's collective leadership any of these questions, you will get at least a half dozen different answers. And that's before getting down to the nitty-gritty details of bank bailouts, or debt levels, or negotiating authority, or political norms, or voting parameters. Even relatively mild disputes require the heads of state hashing out the details during multiple all-night summits. The really big issues, such as how to address a sovereign debt crisis or undocumented migration, occupy all leadership bandwidth for a decade or more. There's also the not-so-minor issue of who's in charge. Formally, the EU presidency rotates among all the members for 6-month terms. Under the order, this slowly, softly, oddly ambling path to integration was fine. The Americans did all the heavy lifting on the security front via NATO, on the global front via their Navy, on the energy front via their position in the Persian Gulf, on the raw materials front via their primacy in the Western Hemisphere and their alliance with Australia, and on the trade front via the World Trade Organization, as well as keeping all of Europe lined up on the same side. Europe could afford to have knockdown, drag-out, multi-day arguments with itself over cheese policy. That's not a joke. For the Germans, all this dysfunction is part of contemporary Europe's beauty. NATO bars security competition among the European powers. No matter how messy or awkward or myopic the EU might become, keeping the field of competition purely economic enables Germany to be physically intact and industrially dynamic. For Berlin, that's what matters. That's all that matters. With wealth rising, stability assured, and the Germans quiescent, many Europeans have come to believe in a heady dream that after centuries of living in the world's most blood-soaked lands, they had finally achieved a sort of historical escape velocity. It's a beautiful dream. I want to believe it too. But with the American abdication of responsibility, that dream dies. Europe is a region of military pygmies who face pressing military challenges. A region suffering demographic implosion, unable to absorb immigrants. A region peppered with xenophobes who cannot control their borders. A region rumbling with environmentalists who cannot generate green power. A region facing a banking crisis that lacks the means of even defining the problem, much less rectifying it. A region that has largely outsourced its relationships with its nearest neighbors of significance, Turkey and Russia, to the departing Americans. A region whose most coherent economic, financial, and military power, the United Kingdom, has left.